But let me start first of all, because these are not in order of the way they were written. Years and years ago, Ken Dorn, I don't know where you're aware of him, put out some big publication asking composers for pieces for saxophone, and I think he said specifically alto saxophone, and a singer, dancer, actress, which was the first wife. And so that was actually the first piece, and that was years and years ago. That must have been back in either the late 60s or the 1970s. Anyway, about some years after that, he sent it back. He said, "I'm sorry, we're divorced." There's no, whatever. A major instrument starting in, I guess, 6th or 7th grade was the clarinet. So finger stuff, that kind of stuff I was aware of. And that particular piece didn't have any really fancy stuff that went back and forth the same thing, that I would have to really figure out the fingering carefully on that. And then years later, Holick came to the School of the Arts, but he had been teaching at East Carolina. And he became assistant dean. And I can't remember if I first met him once he was assistant dean, because he always had this door that was open. So particularly late afternoon, I would go in and talk. But before that even happened, one of his students, I guess he was a senior at that point, Jonathan Hilton. At the time that Jonathan was playing for Holick and studying with him, his tone was absolutely gorgeous. He was playing very musical. I won't talk about his later playing, but anyway, because he spent years at Northwestern with this French guy who had all these theories, and so then you played by these theories.
Yeah.
And so Jonathan Hilton was an A student, and so he came to me because he had a graduation recital coming up before he got his bachelor, and said, "Would you write a piece for me?" And so I said, "Sure," and I actually did. I had heard a lot of Holick's students. They all learned how to bow and have stage presence. A lot of other people had no clue. So obviously I paid a lot of attention, particularly during the student performances. So I wrote this piece for Jonathan, but I said, "Now, so come in and we'll talk about it." Every single saxophone type, I have a sheet, a technical sheet, where I've got, if there are any problems with trills. My main thing was if I had some tremolos or fast back and forth, which of the notes are easy. So Jonathan came in, and I wrote down, I had, again, I can't find it, where I had the whole range all the way up to the high F and maybe a little beyond. And so I had him play each one of those notes, first medium, then very soft, and then very loud, and then sort of back and forth. So we spent about an hour and a half where we're going the entire register, listening to the sounds and how they were, and then doing some of the tremolo fingerings and watching the fingers, listening, of course, the keys going slap, 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 and some of those, but the better instruments nowadays don't do quite as much with that. But so every one of the instruments of the sax family, I have a sheet on, but that was the first one. And Holick kind of picked up his ears and some of the other students. And at that point, a few years after Jonathan graduated, then Pollock and those guys that made the original New Century Quartet, a lot of them were students of mine. And again, it came time for a graduation recital, and Pollock asked me if I would write a piece for him. So we spent a lot of time, and I think at that point, I had heard a lot of the solos, either he or some of the other guys had played. So I had an idea of what it sounded like with piano. Because once you put some of these instruments with piano, they actually sound quite different. And particularly because of the intonation, and the quality that goes with that. But anyway, so I was sort of pleased with the Summer Nocturne, but I knew that the sound of the tenor was quite different, particularly with Pollock. I mean, Jim was kind of like this with him, just the way the instrument was and the way that he, the guy was playing the instrument. But anyway, so I wrote this piece, and I knew if it were good, Jim would snatch it up and run with it, and he did. With Jim, I don't know your situation, but I never got to coach him on any of my pieces. The only times are when we were doing the big CD with all the sax things we did there. Because Vahan would say, "Oh, maestro," and Jim, "Oh God, stop it!" And they said, "Take 45."
Can I ask you about Wind Mountains Rising?
Yes.
I understand that there's a lot of poetic influence there. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yes, there was a poet. The poetry is not published, as far as I know, and she's been dead many years. But it was a friend of mine, and she was a really wonderful poet. She lived in Durham. I knew her from a number of organizations. And I asked her if I could use that in my music, and the music eventually got published. Those were suggested mood, color kind of things, just to kind of help the player out.
Mm-hmm.
And so Holick, I don't know where he still does, but for many years, I mean, that was one of his major recital pieces. And it was so that when we talked about it originally with Pollock, I knew just by the way some of the pieces were going that they were doing in recitals that maybe they couldn't do 3 movements, so they could choose a movement.
Mm-hmm.
The same thing with the Sinfonia and actually all of the other works for saxophone that had multi-movements. Each movement was so it could stand on its own. When Brad asked me, because he was, many years later, because I had already done a piece for a sonata for the alto, which is very different from the one that I had done for Jonathan Helton, and that was for Drew Hayes, who was getting his doctorate at UNC Greensboro. And so he and I spent many, hours together. I think I must have met with him 4 or 5 times, and I actually coached him with his pianist, and 1 or 2 times when his teacher was there in the studio because he played maybe, 6 of the pieces. Anyway, so I spent a lot of time working with him, and the first thing, even though, he had a good tone and played pretty musically just because he'd studied so much and he'd got his bachelor degree or maybe even master's, I can't remember, there at Duquesne with Jim. He was already a fine player. So there wasn't a lot to do, but the thing that he was interested in and that his teacher was interested in were all these nuance markings, all the funny accents, whatever. And I was trained, I guess I was really lucky because I grew up in Austin, Texas, and they taught us to read music very early in the grade school. First grade, well, it was only rhythms, a rhythm band and all this kind of stuff. Yeah. But by the time I got to the 6th grade, I had a whole year with a lady called Virginia Dare. This was an big Italian lady. I mean, she'd come at you like a bear, but it was really like what would be a college course. She taught us sight singing. We had to sing with the syllables. She'd write the stuff on the board. She'd point to you. You had to sing it. She'd drop the needle. You had to identify composer, period, instruments, sometimes form. I mean, this lady just taught us so much. I mean, by the time I went to college, it was like, what am I doing here? This is, baby stuff. But I was lucky so that I knew everything about it in notation, so that when finally, we could have a band instrument. And my people were very poor. My mother had been a fantastic pianist and gave that up, but she could sit down and play all that stuff like this, even after not having played for years. She just put it on the piano, and there she go. But the piano was at her mother's house, which wasn't where we were. So I couldn't have a piano. So my friend who lived behind me was also a fine musician, and he had a clarinet. So I said, okay, I'll try clarinet. So that was it. So you went to band, they taught you, F. They taught you one note every lesson. So they gave us, the F. I went home and I wrote a march because I figured out all the other notes, and so that never stopped. But the clarinet was my first instrument. Then when Brad Hubbard asked for a piece for him because he wanted to try to be a soloist. But so because I had already had a baritone player years and years ago, because once she had heard me do that for Jonathan Helton, she was kind of interested, and I forgot her name. And I can't find it anywhere, but I don't see her on anybody's list, so I don't know if she actually stayed with saxophone, but she and I did the same thing. So we spent, about an hour and a half, went through the whole scale, every note, all the various colors, all of the trill, all of the combinations like that, and a few of the altissimo things. And so I already had that. So but I talked, I can't remember if we did it by phone or what, because I didn't see him directly with that. But Brad said, well, please put some altissimo stuff in. And I went, oh, God. Holick had, I can't remember which piece it was. Maybe it was a Robert Ward piece or whatever it was. One of the big pieces has some altissimo stuff. And if you're sitting in the audience, you don't know anything about the instrument, you say, well, what's a funny note? It's just so thin, you don't know what's going on. So nobody knows what big deal it is. I'll do what I did with one of the other pieces that asked for altissimo. I'll just put it in a cadenza and let them deal with it. So if it doesn't work, they can leave it out, won't hurt the piece. I had the internet, and I had the ability to go on YouTube and listen to all of these pieces with baritone, saxophone, and piano. But so I listened to all of those to get the sound of your instrument with the piano. And then I wrote it and sent it to Brad. And so I didn't hear from him for a long time because he was still looking for a piano player. Mm-hmm. Because the piano is not an accompanying instrument with any of my pieces. It's chamber music. They're all, and that was the thing with Holick. It would take him a while before he'd ever listen to the piano and actually dialogue with it. He'd just play his part, So he got a lot better with that. Anyway, so I never got to work with Brad on the piece. I had worked a long time with the New Century on Sinfonia.
Yeah.
And I mean, their recording is still the best performance ever of anybody that I've ever heard. But again, they worked very hard on it. It's a very difficult piece. But, they understood what I was after. And I guess what I was telling you with some of that stuff today is that all of those funny little marks, mm-hmm. Virginia Dare had already taught us all of those marks, and they taught us that in band. All of those accents, nuance marks, whatever. And I don't see that with a lot of stuff nowadays. For some reason, I put a lot of that in, hopefully to help the player, but not for them to do it mechanically. I'm hoping, as I said, that they actually practice it. And by the way, the New Century did, they spent hours with the shape and everything like that, and also trading off who had the melody and who was in the background.
Those brackets in Sinfonia are so helpful.
Well, and the thing is that they actually used highlighters, so that when it was their solo, or their turn with the melody, I can't remember which color it was, but that was when play real louder than anybody else, regardless of what it says. And if they were for sure an accompaniment, they had another marking. And if they were like subordinate counter melody, they had another one. So their original things were all marked up. But they were fantastic. But again, I spent a lot of time with them. And I spent some time, certainly the same kind of way with Drew, working with the pieces he did. Certainly writing for specific specific players, and I've written so many pieces for Jim. I mean, that just sort of turns me on because I know when he walks out on stage, what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, it's going to be a great thing. And so that's very exciting for me to be able to work with somebody like that. And so I took that same approach with your piece as I worked with it. So the pieces are influenced certainly by who I'm writing for and the energies that they bring to their performances, because that's a great plus for me. And, you know, I was just, you know, still remembering you playing that slow movement, and that was never heard it so beautiful. I mean, just amazing.
Did you have any like inspiration behind this specific piece?
Not other than just a great baritone sax player coming out and doing one of those Jim Hulick performances.
Yeah.
And that is so exciting to do that. So, I mean, that was really all I needed in a sense. So I think the piece was, I don't know if I put dates for each of the movement, but it came pretty fast. The only thing that took a while was actually the cadenza and making sure that I got to the end the way I wanted to. And the real problem with the piano part is sometimes either they play the left hand bottom note too loud,
Mm-hmm.
or not loud enough, but that has to be there because all of the acoustical notes are based on like overtone or not overtone from the bass note.
Mm-hmm.
And so that changes absolutely the way the whole thing sounds. If you change the bass note, everything else sounds different, even though nothing else has changed, even when the sax is playing.
Really,
So that's an important thing. Sometimes you may see a little too much of that piano left-hand stuff going on, but again, it's there for resonance.
so you've written all these pieces for different individuals. How do you think that your relationship with these individuals and writing for them has changed throughout your career?
I don't know if it's changed. You know, again, it started with Jim Hulick. And so once I started going in and talking to him, I found out that he had this same concept because, you know, you go to a student performance and you come out and you go, well, you know. And so I think one Wednesday I went, I evidently just had it. Faculty didn't have to attend the performance hours on Wednesdays, but I did because, you know, I would have students there who were playing and they expected me to be there and appreciate, and I would appreciate, but whether it was good or bad. And I must have gone in and said something about the performance that day, and he started and I started, and I saw we were like this, that we had the same concept. And I don't know where he was trained to shape the music. I mean, he, for example, like when we were there at Wild Acres and he was suggesting things to each of the players, they'd stand up and do their thing. If they were really good, he would go into really good things and shapes, nuances, or whatever. And I'm sitting and thinking, God, I would have said that. You know, some of the sax stuff about, you know, about a fingering option or a vibrato or whatever, you know, I wouldn't have known. But all the musical stuff, I was thinking, that's exactly what I would have said. And it was so interesting because I had never heard him teach before.
Really?
At the School of the Arts, I was on many of the faculty review things. And so I did years with percussionists and double bass, and, you know, I'd go in there. So I knew all the literature and knew what the problems were. But that also was great for me as a composer, learning all those kind of things. And the same kind of thing occasionally with violin or with voice. But I never was in with the saxophone thing. So I'm not sure. I guess it was he and Ron Rudkin. But what was so interesting was when a high school student, and I can't remember, it was from San Antonio or whatever, but the fellow that had braces, remember that?
Mm-hmm.
Was having problems. Jim was so gentle, and he only gave suggestions that he thought the guy could deal with.
Yeah, he's amazing. He can teach anybody.
It was fantastic, you know, and I was thinking, gee, I mean, God, and how lucky for people to keep studying with him. I mean, I saw that all the years that people were studying with him.
You started on clarinet and you moved through the ranks.
Right.
Middle school, high school, Did
Yeah.
you continue with clarinet through high school?
Oh yes, I was always first chair. Until I got to Austin High. There was only one high school in Austin at that point, and their band was the best one in Texas. I mean, we did, New World Symphony by Dvorak, Death and Transfiguration. I mean, you name it, we played it.
Wow.
And the conductor was absolutely phenomenal. He was the husband of my band teacher, and she was originally a clarinet, but this lady, this gorgeous lady, that if you didn't play it right, I mean, she'd be in your face. So we all learned, from day one, play it musically. I mean, you got to be in tune. I mean, this lady didn't take any nonsense. Her husband was much more gentle, but by this point, people had gone through the mill, junior high school, and so it was a phenomenal experience. So I wasn't sitting first chair at that point. Then I moved to Tyler, Texas, and I was immediately first chair because their band was nowhere near as great as the one I'd come from. But I did that, and then because we were poor, I sent off to all of these various places, and Southern Methodist, I got several scholarships, but Southern Methodist was the first one that offered me full scholarship. So I was there for 2 years, and the first year I did what the regular freshman program was, and all that stuff was, I had all that stuff in the 7th grade or 6th grade with Virginia Dare, including all the theory stuff, and had taught myself. Actually, when I was in Austin, my mother weekly would take us to the public library, and the public library had the most fantastic music collection, and they had all of the books, how each of the instruments, you learned to play the instruments. They had all the theory books, all the counterpoint books, I did all that stuff before I went to college. And so second year there at Southern Methodist, the School of Music was good, but not like it is now. And there was a composer there, and you couldn't take composition until you were a senior. And I wasn't interested actually in learning composition with him because he wanted you to be another him.
Yeah.
And I didn't want that. But they let me take whatever I wanted. So I was taking senior and graduate courses in music that second year. And the musicologist who did the I can't remember if they call it music history or whatever, was very sympathetic and let me borrow a key to use the clavichord, his clavichord upstairs after hours. I mean, all sorts of really wonderful kind of things. And I said, I'd really like to go to the Curtis Institute of Music. And at that point, Samuel Barber and Minotti were teaching.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And so he said, well, we'll help you get there. And so I put together a package this thick of, symphony. I mean, it was like 5 pounds of music. I turned in, but he had written all of the letters of recommendation. He wrote a beautiful one, and then quote, my theory teacher, I didn't write it, but he wrote both of them. So I got in, and they sent me a letter midsummer saying Minotti and Barber are no longer teaching. Oh, God.
Oh.
But Václav Martinu, the famous Czech composer, is going to be teaching. And I said, well, who is this? Anyway, so I took a train. I moved to Philadelphia. God knows, it was somehow, and I got a job because I needed money. But I went to the public library, and they had recordings of Václav Martinu's music. So I got to listen to it. And the one that I was so taken with was the double concerto for 2-string orchestras, percussion, and something else I can't remember. And it was one of his better pieces. So I thought, well, that is pretty good. So I studied with him the first term. First term, he would take the train from New York, where he lived. He would arrive late and eat cookies over the piano while he was giving the lesson. English, not too good. And he'd leave early because of the train. So they docked his pay. And he says, I can no longer do this. So he, no coming back for second term. And down the hall, Euphemia Giannini, who voice teacher for lots of famous singers. She says, "Oh, my brother, he come teach." So Vittorio, who's teaching at Juilliard, he'd been there for years, composer of some note. He was teaching Manhattan School of Music. He came, and so I studied with him. And because he liked to perform, so in all these other schools, it was a composition class, and he would perform. You listen to your piece, and he would tell you about your piece, and the next piece, whatever. And he came to Curtis, and the director was a very famous Russian violinist, says, no, we do not do classes for composition, because he also was a composer, Ephraim Zimbalist. And he says, we have private lessons, 1 hour every week. Well, Vittorio wasn't used to that. And so I went in, and I had done a string quartet with Martinu. And with Martinu, because neither of us could really play it on the piano, so he'd live there. And then sometimes he would say, here. And I'd say, what about that? He says, well, and then I had to go home and figure out what was wrong with that. One time I said, Maestro, what would you do? So he took this pencil and very lightly sketched. And he did something so it wasn't an exact repetition. It had a little kick to it. And I thought, special. It was a sense of making it music interesting. Mm-hmm. And because the music was great. With Vittorio, he said, well, your harmony is weak. And I said, it's weak. It's because I couldn't play the stuff on the piano, right? And so we spent, I think, 6 weeks on harmony. And so I was the one that made the curriculum for me. Nobody else was doing anything like I was doing. He was teaching me technique. Mm-hmm. And so I said, okay, I'll bring in a Bach chorale. Here's how he harmonized it. And so I could play that. And then I did 2 or 3 harmonizations and make it so that, and Vittoria was great about, okay, you didn't get to the cadence without us feeling like it dropped off before we got there. You need to have something there. It's a sentence. And Holik, I don't know where he talks to you that way, but he and I, as we were talking about performance, I mean, you're making a trip. And the trip goes here, and you find where's the shape, and where's the different thing. Any surprises? And does it cadence? You can take a breath. Or does it align? If it aligns, then that's a surprise. You kick it. We were all under the threat of being drafted. And I can't remember what war it was. I forgot. Anyway, so I had to always keep getting something from the director of Curtis that I was still, going toward my degree. And they would give me a deferment. And so actually, I studied with Vittorio there for 5 years. And I didn't know that at the end of the 5th year, he said, no, I'm not coming back next year. He said, I just wanted to finish out with you. He stayed an extra year so that I would be deferred 1 more year from the draft. Well, my graduation recital was the first composition graduation recital since Barbara Minotti. At the end of that, Vittorio said, I said, well, my deferment, they're going to call me up. And he said, well, if you don't get drafted, he said, you come to Manhattan School of Music and study with me there for a master's. A friend of my roommate and I had borrowed his sister's car, and we went touring around things, listening to concerts and so on. We went to Albany somewhere, and this food didn't quite look right, but I ate it anyway. So the doctor wrote, so I was deferred. Deferred, whatever, I didn't have to go. And so I then immediately went to New York, found an apartment, and signed up. And at that point, school was very inexpensive. I think it was only maybe $700 or $800 a term at Manhattan for your master's. And I had this fantastic job working down in Wall Street. And so I was on the 4 until 12 o'clock shift. So I could do all of my classes at Curtis, do all my stuff I needed to, and still have enough sleep. And so I did the two years for a master's. And even before that was over, Vittorio says, okay, the next year they're making me the chair of the whole theory department. He said, I want you on that faculty. So he immediately gave me a job. So I was in charge of the whole freshman program. And at one point he says, I'm setting up this school down in North Carolina. It's going to be an art school, like a conservatory. He said, I want you down there. And I said, oh, sure. Right. So we never said anything else about it. A year and a half later, he calls me up, says, come sign the contract. And I said, what contract? And he said, the one at the School of the Arts in North Carolina. And I thought, you are crazy. Anyway, he says, come on over. So I went over to his apartment. So he hands me the pen. And I'm standing there. I don't know what to do, because here I'm teaching at Manhattan School of Music. I'm in New York, for heaven's sakes. And I watched the hand sign the contract. I watched the hand sign the contract. Oh, I got all these wonderful things that would never have happened in New York. And, you know, met Holick. I mean, all these wonderful things that happened. My previous roommate, because he had a job now up in Oswego. We had both, you know, kind of left Manhattan at the same time, but he could drive and I couldn't. So he moved me down to Winston-Salem. We arrived on a Saturday afternoon, and the first street we came to was Trade Street, which was nothing but pawn shops and adult bookstores. And I started crying. I was so mad. We were all foreigners when we moved down here because everybody was brought in. I mean, some famous, really famous performers. Vittorio was the president at that point. He gave me that job, you know, he gave me both jobs. And so it was like family, because it was a small school at that point. Really, you know, it wasn't an accredited school. We just started. It was vibrant. And then Robert Ward, who's a much more well-known composer, and Holick, you know, has a piece by Rob Ward that he's played a lot. And so then Bob Ward came in. But, you know, from then on, though, it was all right. I'm glad I'm here, because, I mean, I think about I would still be stuck in New York in an apartment, and, you know, if you don't have lots of money, your apartment is not a great place.
Yeah, it's some really great influences. I was going to ask you how you got like into the music business, but you were just kind of thrown in there.
Well, is true. You know, and I even before I had all of that wonderful training from Virginia Dare about music. I mean, I love the music. And so I had already decided at that point, for sure, even before the clarinet, that I wanted to do that. So, I mean, it was very clear in my mind, you know, from the very beginning where I wanted to go with that. Let me tell you, when Holick came here, he had a guy, Scott Schilling, and he had trained at Juilliard or somewhere, I can't remember. He hated to perform. But when he and Holick, I mean, because they were magic together, but this guy hated doing it. So he didn't do that too many years, and he finally stopped playing piano. But the interesting thing is being able to hear those performances, again, all the way through. Even when I was at Curtis, I was always listening to what makes a really great performance. And when I was in New York, Lottie Lehman, a famous opera singer that had worked with Richard Strauss, she did all a whole series of master classes. She was living in California at that point, teaching master classes, teaching people how to shape the music. Mm-hmm. And so I learned so much from that. And of course, she was working with poetry. So you got words that help you know where you need to put accents, where, you know what I'm saying, the kind of things like that. But it was the kind of thing that really impressed me. And it's the kind of thing that I was so surprised that Holick and had exactly the same sense, because not a lot of sax players have that.
Kulik always talks about in his undergrad how he would take all of the speech courses.
Really?
Yeah, every single one that was offered. He wanted to figure out the inflections, and he always talks about his influence by singers as well. So I wonder what the overlap is there. That's really interesting.
Well, with the, with me, it was with the singers because it was easiest for me to access because it's on television or now, with the internet stuff. We also have a fantastic drama school here at School of the Arts, North Carolina School of the Arts now. So I got to hear rehearsals with that where they would help them shape not only the movement themselves, but all of that and shape the sounds. And one of them I got to talk to periodically because she had worked with some very famous English actors. She was actually English herself. And she said, oh, listen to Charles Lawton. He has online, he has a reading of this. Listen to how he shapes it. And I started listening to those things. And that I hear what how Jim would really be infected. You learn from it. It's just amazing. And even today, like with Meryl Streep, when she's in one of her fantastic, she just lives it. You can hear the difference. You know what I'm saying? When somebody loves playing, even if the technique is not totally there yet or something, you know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
When I was in Curtis, one of because they were these fantastic faculty, Rudolf Serkin, famous Austrian pianist, he would come out and he would play, and he'd make a wrong note, but it didn't matter because, the music was still there.
Mm-hmm. It's
I like that.
been a blast to play your music.
Well, the other thing is too, because, we're going, shapes, phrases, I mean, they go somewhere, there may be surprises there, whatever, but there are things that you learn, like another phrase starts with a but.
Yep.
And or however, or and also, you know what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
And I think like that, and that's the other thing about the phrasing. Like, I know there once in a while, at least for some players, sometimes a phrase is too long in terms of a breath. So my suggestion, and that's why I worked with Drew and some of the others on some of the pieces that there was a problem like that, to show them where they can take a breath, not lose the energy, but not divide, because they're like words. They're these patterns. And so you don't break a pattern. And as long as you have that feeling that it's not over, you got more to say, another however, or whatever it is, the audience can feel that. It was really interesting. Years ago, there was a really wonderful string quartet. They were all seniors. One of them now has been teaching violin for years over at professor of violin over at UNCG. They were doing, and I can't remember what the piece was, but one of the famous string quartets. And they took the repeat for the exposition before they went on to the development, whatever. And when they did the cadence to on the repeat for the exposition, they did it so final, including me, we all started clapping. I mean, piece was nowhere over, and so that was one of the things that, you sort of have to feel where you are in the piece.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of it had to do and I talked to the violinist who's in charge of that. He said, oh yeah, he says, I know. He says, we were so tired because we'd been practicing so much that same day that when we got to that cadence, we thought, oh, at least we've done the repeat. There it is. But it was just too much.
Do you feel like the saxophone's potential has been reached?
No, I don't. And I know there's a lot there that I'm not quite experimental enough to try. And some of the pieces that I've listened to online, we're trying some multiphonics or other kinds of things. And there I was really interested in Oklahoma, the ensemble that played.
Mm-hmm.
They were fantastic.
Yeah.
I mean, I was amazed. And they did some things that had slaps, tongues, you know, all various kinds of things and keys and whatever. And it was part of the music. It was not a gimmicky thing. So I think there's a lot that can be done. And there may be even more that can be done with the altissimo where it actually sounds like it really belongs. I think, you know, you've got a blank canvas there to work with, and a marvelous instrument. That was the thing I was surprised. Beth Shirk. That was the name of the lady that way back. And I'll have to ask Jim if he ever knew any more about her. This was years ago. Beth Shirk came in with her baritone sax, and we had an hour and a half. She was so gracious to spend time with me on that, so that was helpful for me to realize this instrument is not a clunker. You know, because once in a while you'll hear a young player and you know, they're fighting it. And usually they're fighting it because they had started on one of the smaller instruments and hadn't really got used to it.
I just want to thank you for doing this. I really appreciate it.
What a joy, and thank you so much for asking me to do this. When Jim called me up originally, I said, oh, wow, what a great idea. I love it. That's fantastic.
Super excited.
And so, I mean, it's really like career development for you. And what your product, however you deal with this, is what you can put out there as your performance outlets right now, you know, and use those to find other performance outlets. You know,
I mean, you're fully aware that my hope is to document new works for baritone saxophone, but
and I think that's great.
I feel like I have an opportunity to do something a little bit more.
Good.
I mean, connections between composers and artists are so important, and I feel like a lot of the music that my colleagues play are kind of lost to the ages because we don't have information on how they are to be played, which
That's
is
right.
lovely because you have all those nuanced, you have like a chart.
That's right.
It's awesome, super helpful.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I probably need to put what I was telling you that I sent you today. You know, the idea is don't do it mechanically. Just learn that it sounds this way and try it that way. If you can learn it that way, and you know, play it that way, and don't think about the nuances that they're part of it, the natural part. Well, thank you. I'm just so cheering you on for your career and hoping you've got some ways of, you know, dealing with all this mess that's happening so you don't get lost in the shuffle.
Yeah. Do you have any advice for young artists, musicians right now?
I think you just have to be as creative as possible. That's one of the reasons I was suggesting you know, look at some of the stuff that some of these performers now are doing online. You know, there are lots of possibilities there. Wonderful. Oh, thank you so much. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
All right.